In this film, we will explore the Egyptian pyramids, the Peruvian polygonal masonry, and the ritual of male circumcision. What connects these three completely different topics? Not what, but who. In the medieval Edo Castle in Tokyo, within the grounds of the Emperor of Japan's palace, there is polygonal masonry, almost identical to that in Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire. Where did the Japanese learn this rather complex and original stoneworking technique? If until the 17th century, Japan was a strictly regional, backward feudal state whose contacts were limited to neighboring China and Korea. During the Sakoku period, the time of Japan's self-isolation from the early 17th to the mid-19th century, the Japanese could not observe techniques from anyone but themselves. And it was then, during Japan's isolation, that Edo Castle was built, some sections of which, not all, just certain ones, clearly point to the Peruvian polygonal style of the Cusco region. And Cusco, as is officially accepted, was the capital city of the Inca Empire until the arrival of Europeans in Peru in 1533. The only organization whose influence extended across all of Eurasia, including Japan, as well as both Americas during the Age of Discovery, was the Roman Catholic Church. The first missionaries, they were Franciscans, arrived in Japan in 1549. They gained the trust of Japan's upper class, including many influential military leaders, and through them the shogun, who unlike the Japanese emperor, held real power in Japan. The first church in Edo was built in 1599 by Franciscan Father Geronimo de Jesus Castro. Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, the de facto ruler of Japan, trusted Father Geronimo so much that he made him his envoy on an important mission to the Philippines. And it was from this time, the late 16th century, that the construction of Edo Castle with elements of polygonal masonry began, when Franciscans, the best architects and builders of that time, were present in Edo. For example, this aqueduct in Mexico, an exact copy of a Roman aqueduct, was built in the 16th century by local indigenous people under the direction of the Franciscan architect and builder Padre Temblec. Later, this aqueduct was named in his honor. Learn more about the Franciscan monks, remarkable builders of roads, bridges, aqueducts, and structures from the 15th to 17th centuries, in my previous film on this channel. The Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries was the first wave of globalization, in which Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, later Jesuits, and some other monastic orders were almost the main driving force, the soft power of this globalization, as we might say today. Monks reshaped the consciousness of the local population and prepared them for market relations, where for a small fee and goods from Europe, indigenous people were ready to move mountains, quite literally. In previous films on the history of the New World, I explained in detail how historians of the 18th and 19th centuries, commissioned by church authorities, shifted the creation date of Latin America's megalithic structures from the 16th to 18th centuries to the fabricated era of pre-Columbian indigenous civilizations like the Maya, Aztecs, Incas, and others. Along with the megaliths and indigenous pagan temples of the 16th to 18th centuries, historians moved the so-called roads of the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas several centuries into the past, even though, before the arrival of Europeans, they had no draft animals for these roads. It was precisely for this reason, the lack of draft animals, that the indigenous people did not know what the wheel was, not because they were less intelligent than Europeans and Asians, who did have draft animals. Of course, scholars noticed the resemblance between Roman roads and the roads of pre-Columbian America, some of which were up to 4 meters wide, but they can't say anything, because official history, the one in textbooks and Wikipedia, is a state ideological tool for managing public consciousness. If you are a scholar or a teacher and go against official history, you will be expelled from science or from your institution. Therefore, everyone remains silent and supports the official version that these roads, spanning the entire continent, were built by indigenous people exclusively for foot traffic, which is, of course, utterly absurd. A pedestrian would be much better off on a well-trodden dirt path than on uneven or even sharp stones. The Silk Road managed without a single stone-paved road, as pack animals do not require paved roads, and a stone road is only necessary for wheeled carts to prevent them from sinking into the ground. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when the history of the 15th to 17th centuries was being rewritten and reprinted using 18th century fonts. On the left, the actual font of the early 16th century, known as woodcut or xylography, that is, printing from wooden blocks. And on the right, supposedly also from the early 16th century. But this is already typography, meaning printing with reusable types, which were invented no earlier than the late 17th century. But this invention was later shifted into the mid-15th century to make it easier to reprint edited 15th to 17th century books by reusable types, rather than using the more labor-intensive woodcut technique, or xylography, carving on wood. These are also actual fonts from the second half of the 17th century. At that time, reusable type had not yet been invented. On the left is printing from copper plates using an etching technique with acid, and on the right, printing from wooden blocks, or xylography. So, when the history of the 15th to 17th centuries was being rewritten and reprinted in the 18th and 19th centuries using 18th century fonts, it was the Church, primarily the Roman Catholic Church, that was responsible for ideology and therefore history at that time. All other churches, including Protestant ones, were also interested in lengthening the history of Christianity. So they did not resist when events and artifacts from the 15th to 17th centuries in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa were exclusively on paper shifted to the invented era of ancient Rome and the Roman Empire. Similarly, the artifacts of 16th to 18th century Latin America were moved to a fabricated era of pre-Columbian indigenous civilizations. For those interested in the details of how and why history was lengthened and rewritten, my book, The Other History of the Roman Empire, is written especially for you. You'll find the link below, in the description for this film. So, all these artifacts that are inexplicable from the perspective of an elongated history are quite explainable if we view them as artifacts of the European colonization of the Americas, a colonization by Europeans together with indigenous peoples. In the 16th film in this series on Latin America, I included excerpts from a report by Viktor Nikolaevich Berdnikov, candidate of Geological and Mineralogical Sciences and Deputy Director of the Institute of Tectonics and Geophysics in Khabarovsk, Russia, who presented the chemical composition of these stones. The link to this report is provided below in the description. These stones are composed of 70% limestone, specifically of artificial origin, recrystallized limestone without biological remains. The table shows calcium oxide, also known as quicklime, but this is an error of the X-ray fluorescence spectrometer, which does not always recognize the structure of chemical compounds. Roman cement, during the time of European exploration of the Americas, was made up of 70% lime, obtained by burning limestone. The remaining 30% consisted of so-called pozzolans, additives to lime to turn it into a strong cement. Thus, stones formed from this mixture became as strong as Roman cement, the binding compound for Roman concrete. Similar outflows of soft rock occurred not only in Peru, but also in other parts of the world, such as the state of Wyoming. It is clear that this whitish sandstone, apparently mixed with natural lime, was not always as hard as it is now. And here is Machu Picchu, the mysterious city in the mountains of Peru, abandoned and forgotten by the Incas for several centuries. In 1911, American historian and explorer Hiram Bingham traveled the region looking for the old Inca capital and was led to Machu Picchu by a villager, Melchor Artiga. The structures of Machu Picchu are made of so-called whitish granite. What gives it this whiteness is unclear. I could not find publicly available data on the chemical composition of these stones. There are no traces of iron toolwork on these granite blocks, as seen, for example, with the granite in Kronstadt, St. Petersburg. But that dates to the first half of the 19th century. I have 3 films on St. Petersburg granite on this channel. Until the 19th century, there was no fine toolwork of natural granite. No one had that capability. The formed granite embankments of the Neva are artificial granite, cast into special molds. These molds are somewhat similar to those used for baking cookies or gingerbread. It's obvious that there are no traces of stone cutting tools on this granite, just as on the concrete fence section on the left. The secret of artificial granite was guarded by the state itself, so its recipe is stored in secret archives, or it was only kept in the minds of granite masters who took it to the grave. All these drawings by Auguste Montferrand, the French architect and builder, are nothing but a smokescreen. In reality, no one would have made the Alexandrian column from natural coarse-grained granite, as petrologists in the first half of the 19th century were well aware of the properties of coarse-grained granites, particularly the Finnish Rapakivi granite, which weathers and is unsuitable for carving. The massive building shown in the process of demolition in Grigory Gagarin's painting, with thick walls and narrow windows, as well as a pile of quartz sand by the wall. All this was necessary for preparing artificial granite right on site for casting into the formwork of the Alexander Column. I won't repeat myself, check out my films on granite. So, the whitish granite of Machu Picchu, like the St. Petersburg granite of the 18th and 19th centuries, shows no traces of work by iron tools. Yet it is clear that these stones were shaped in some way. The claims by scientists that the Inca shaped these stones using other stones are linked to the decision, made around the 18th century, as mentioned earlier, to shift these structures to a time predating the discovery of the Americas by Europeans. And before the Europeans, indigenous peoples did not have iron tools, so they supposedly shaped these stones using other stones. This was the unavoidable conclusion of scientists. Meanwhile, some of these stones clearly show marks from wooden formwork. Where else can we find granite that was worked before the 19th century and shows signs of being artificial granite? Of course, in Egypt, the Pyramid of Menkaure, one of the 3 great pyramids of Giza. Unlike the granites of Machu Picchu, the chemical composition of various Aswan granites, which scientists believe were used to clad the third of the Great Pyramids, the Pyramid of Menkaure, is publicly available. In the natural Aswan granites, thought to have been used in the cladding of the Pyramid of Menkaure, the calcium oxide content hovers around 2%. In the granite blocks of Menkaure, however, its content is 6 times higher. The data on the chemical composition of the granite blocks of the Pyramid of Menkaure are taken from this article. Based on this data, I instructed OpenAI Artificial Intelligence to create a possible recipe for making artificial granite, taking into account that the Egyptians likely used granite grus, decomposed granite fragments, as the main filler. There are thousands upon thousands of tons of granite grus in Egypt, especially around Aswan, in the Upper Nile region. In my instructions to the AI, I also noted that ammonium chloride, or sal ammoniac, was likely added to the artificial granite. Posmedium. This is because ammonium chloride, or sal ammoniac, is cryptically referenced in the form of a bust of Jupiter Ammon in the study of Count Alexander Stroganov in St. Petersburg, along with the Latin inscription, Egyptian art revived in Petropolis, meaning St. Petersburg. And now, here's the proposed recipe for artificial granite with an elevated calcium compound contents, provided by artificial intelligence. Take granite grus, or granules, from Upper Egypt in the Aswan region. Grind feldspar into a fine powder. Feldspar will provide potassium and sodium ions. Also, grind quartz sand into a fine powder to create a foundation for silicate crystallization. Gather wood ash to create alkaline water. Sal ammoniac, also known as ammonium chloride, will act as a catalyst, accelerating the crystallization of feldspar and silicates, which will form a glass-like coating around the granite granules. Add a small amount of quicklime to speed up the crystallization process. In a large container, mix the granite grus, powdered feldspar, quartz sand, alkaline water from the wood ash, sal ammoniac, and quicklime. Stir thoroughly until you have a thick, uniform mixture. Pour this viscous mixture into molds, shaping it into blocks as needed. I want to emphasize once again that this recipe was generated by artificial intelligence based on the chemical composition of these granite blocks. Plus, my guess is that ammonium chloride was likely part of the Egyptian artificial granite recipe. Until the 19th century, Egypt was the leading producer of both granite and ammonium chloride. Now, take a look at these granite blocks. They are located near the Pyramid of Menkaure, in the Temple of Menkaure. The shape of this granite resembles a loaf of bread with a top crust. This crust formed because the mixture slightly overflowed the mold and hardened. It's clear that the formation of these granite blocks, with their unusually high calcium content, occurred in formwork, which caused these overflows. It is obvious that this granite is of artificial origin. The elevated calcium content in this granite is likely due to the addition of powdered quicklime to the granite mixture. By the way, Roman cement contained not only slaked lime, but also quicklime to speed up the hardening of the cement or concrete mixture. In a practical essay on cement and artificial stone, published in 1776, the following is stated about Roman cement and quicklime. If all we want is a strong coating, then, by adding to the common mortar, consisting of flaked lime and sand, 1/4 its quantity of quicklime, we shall have one, which, within 4 and 20 hours, acquires a greater degree of consistence than the common kind in several months. This is what real Roman concrete looks like. The Park of the Monsters in Bomarzo, built for the Orsini family, was constructed in 1580. Before modern Portland cement was invented in the 19th century, all concrete was Roman concrete. The process of slaking quicklime with water causes the cement mixture to expand and release heat. For lime mortars used in stone masonry or wall plastering, the expansion of the mixture is not significant. But for artificial stone blocks, where quicklime was added, the expansion of the block was significant. This is because the surface of the block hardens first, forming a solid stone crust, while the inside continues to expand. Slaked lime, resulting from quicklime, has a lower density and therefore a larger volume at the same mass. To prevent the hardened crust of the block from cracking due to the internal expansion of the mixture, similar to a baked loaf of bread, fairly large holes were struck in the lower part of the outer side of the block, allowing excess pressure and surplus viscous mass to escape. These are the so-called bosses. This is the Peruvian masonry technique. Sometimes the mixture was so viscous that even larger openings had to be struck in the stone crust. And here we are in Egypt, the same construction techniques. Were there Franciscans in Egypt, who, as we know, were the best builders of the Renaissance and later periods. The Franciscans built roads, bridges, aqueducts, and managed silver mines, essentially acting as a ministry of construction, transportation infrastructure, and natural resources for the Roman Catholic Church. This church was led by the Minister General, the title of the head of the monastic order both then and now. The first ministries were established by the Roman Catholic Church. Here are the main ministries of the Roman Church, as generated by artificial intelligence in response to my query. Franciscans, Ministry of Construction. They built churches and monasteries. Their architectural legacy is visible in many cities across Europe. I'll add that, as mentioned earlier, the Franciscans built not only churches and monasteries. Dominicans, Ministry of Finance. This order was often involved in banking and lending activities. Benedictines, Ministry of Health. Benedictine monasteries often had hospitals and pharmacies. Cistercians, Ministry of Agriculture. They actively engaged in farming and introduced innovations in agriculture. Jesuits, Ministry of Education. They established educational institutions across Europe and were known for their high level of education. I'll add that the Jesuits created modern forms of school and higher education. Carmelites, Ministry of Spiritual Development. They focused on meditation and spiritual practice. Templars, Ministry of Defense. This knightly order, alongside their involvement in finance, also played a significant role in defending Christianity during the Crusades. We'll discuss the Franciscans in Egypt a bit later, but for now, here's a small addition to the topic of the Egyptian pyramids. I've already shown various sources suggesting that the 3 Great Pyramids of Giza did not yet exist at the beginning of the 17th century. For more on the dating and construction methods of the Great Pyramids, see the playlist, Not Ancient Egypt. I'll add to what's already been said with the following information. The well-known French traveler of the 17th to 18th centuries, Paul Lucas, described the Great Pyramids of Giza in his book with these words. We reach these pyramids after crossing a large plain. They are situated on a slight elevation and appear to be built on rocks. This description exactly matches this engraving, drawn close to the time when the pyramids were described by the French traveler Paul Lucas. The fact that these pyramids are not only on rocks, but that limestone was quarried from these very rocks for the construction of the pyramids, and that most of these pyramids are not blocks, but a limestone hill faced with blocks, was confirmed by another famous French traveler, Constantin François Volney. In the beginning of this century, it was thought, based on Herodotus' account, that this material had been transported from another location, but when travelers noticed the identical similarity in both types of stone, they concluded that it was all quarried from the very base of those mountains. And now Herodotus' account is regarded as a kind of myth, and the supposedly imported stones are dismissed as entirely incorrect. It is believed that leveling the rocky hill could have provided most of the stone for the pyramid, and any shortage was supplemented by stones from underground vaults within the pyramids themselves, from which as many stones as needed could be extracted. I mentioned this in my third film on this channel, that the three great pyramids of Egypt were built no earlier than the first half of the 17th century. And here is yet another piece of evidence for the relatively recent age of the Great Pyramids, from Paul Lucas, published at the beginning of the 18th century. After he and his companions descended from the Pyramid of Khufu, he described the two other pyramids among the three Great Pyramids with the following words: "We went to see the two other pyramids. They are not as large or as tall, and they have no openings. Although they are built with steps like the first one, it is impossible to climb them because the cement plaster covering them has not yet eroded enough. Many mistake this cement for marble because it resembles it, but it is merely cement." By the mid-19th century, this photo dated 1851 shows the Pyramid of Khafra could already be climbed quite high, as most of its cement plaster had already fallen off. Only the limestone casing at the top of the pyramid remained. As of the early 18th century, the cement casing of the Pyramid of Khafra was still perceived as marble, meaning it was still relatively fresh and solid. In this photograph, it is clear that the top of the pyramid, presumably its most sacred part, is faced with white limestone, and it is definitely not cement plaster. This is why the upper part of the pyramid did not deteriorate. Now it's time to find out whether the Franciscans were in these areas in the early 17th century to share their construction techniques with the Egyptian king, that is, the pharaoh, in exchange for his favor. And let me remind you that, according to geography, printed by order of Peter the Great in 1710, the Egyptian kingdom still existed in the early 18th century and was in a transitional phase from idolatry to monotheism, that is, from Egyptians to Copts. It clearly states here that the Egyptian kingdom was a tributary to the Turkish Sultan, and only a head of state, the Egyptian king, could be a tributary. If the Copts were subjects of the Turkish Sultan, they would, first, share the same faith as the Sultan, which is Islam, and second, pay taxes directly instead of tribute through their king. But the Coptic Egyptians in the early 18th century paid taxes within their own country to the Egyptian king, who then paid tribute to the Turkish Sultan. All of this is clear evidence that the Egyptian kingdom was still a separate state in the early 18th century. By the way, Copts translates from Greek as the circumcised, meaning those circumcised by the law of Moses, according to the authors of this Russian source printed in 1800. An English source from 1683 states that the Copts and Abyssinians, besides baptism, use circumcision, which they receive on the 8th day, according to the custom of a few. I'll remind you that Jesus, as a Jew, was circumcised on the 8th day, on January 1st. The new year coincides with the church feast of the Circumcision of Jesus. In one of my films, I've already shown this illustration from the book Ceremonies and Religious Customs of the Idolatrous Nations by the French writer and publisher Jean-Frédéric Bernard, published in 1735. The Native Americans of Mexico had a religious ritual similar to that of the Copts. I'll quote the highlighted text fragment. This kind of circumcision and the subsequent washing were in some way an imitation of the circumcision of the Jews and the baptism of Christians. In 1844, a book titled State of Nations, Past and Present, 1,000 Questions and Answers Selected from Modern History, was published in London, which tells surprising things. For example, question: when Columbus discovered this continent, what was the state of the races now called Indians? Answer: they were in different stages of civilization. Some were rude, savage, and ferocious, but the greater number were remarkable for qualities that bespoke a noble origin. They had simple but sublime ideas of a supreme being, unmixed with the least tincture of idolatry. And further in the same source, enumerate the chief points of agreement. First, their belief in one God. Second, their computation of time by the ceremonies of the new moon. Third, their division of the year into seasons corresponding with the Jewish festivals, of the Feast of Flowers, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of the Tabernacle, and other religious holidays. Fourth, the erection of a temple after the manner of the Jews, with an Ark of the Covenant and altars. Fifth, the division of their nation into tribes, with a chief or grand sachem at their head. Sixth, their laws of sacrifices, ablutions, marriages, ceremonies in war and peace, the prohibition of certain food, according to the Mosaic rule, and so on regarding the similarities between the religious traditions of the indigenous people of Mexico and Peru and those of the Judeans, with references to various authors. The Indians of Mexico and Peru are the most enlightened and civilized, though evidently springing from the same stock, and among them, traces of Jewish origin are more apparent. I'll quote another British author, the well-known writer and traveler James Silk Buckingham. Among the Indians of Mexico and Peru, who were the most enlightened and civilized, though all springing from the same stock, the resemblances were more manifest. Montesini, who traveled in South America, states that his Indian guide admitted to him that his God was called Adonai, and he acknowledged Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as his ancestors, and claimed to be descended from the tribe of Reuben. He was, in short, a perfect Jew. Immense numbers like himself were said by him to live behind the Cordilleras. Acosta mentions that they have a tradition relative to the Great Deluge, that they preserve the rite of circumcision, and in Peru they eat the Paschal lamb. Of course, this is much simpler and more prosaic. The indigenous people of Mexico and Peru were not the lost tribes of Israel. They received Judean culture, including the ritual of circumcision, from the first missionaries, monks of the Roman Church, who, unlike the Protestants, preserved the sacred rituals of the Old Testament. And certainly, the indigenous people of Mexico and Peru were the most enlightened among other indigenous groups, not because they were one of the lost tribes of Israel, as some authors of the 17th to 19th centuries believed, but because Mexico and Peru in the 16th to 17th centuries were the richest countries in the world in terms of gold and silver mining. And it was in Mexico and Peru that the power and influence of the Dominicans and Franciscans over the colonists and indigenous people were very strong. Where there is money, there is power. And the Dominicans and Franciscans had money because they controlled silver mines and gold deposits, as mentioned in the previous film. And I will repeat endlessly that Pope Julius II, the most famous pope of the Renaissance, was a Judean. Not a Jew, but specifically a Judean. On his tomb, Michelangelo sculpted the chief Judean prophet Moses, as well as Leah and Rachel, the mothers of 8 of the 12 sons of Israel, the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. You won't find anything Christian on his tomb. But if Pope Julius II himself was a Judean and lived by the law of Moses, then so were his monks whom he sent to the Americas. All that remains is to answer the question: did the Franciscans practice the ritual of circumcision in the 16th century? Let's read this English source, a multi-volume work from the late 17th century about the Council of Trent. It was thought fit to omit the 5th article, as decided in the former session. But Friar Bartholomew Miranda called to mind that Luther, by that paradox of his, that the sacraments do not confer grace, but by exciting faith, drew also a conclusion that those of the Old and of the Evangelical Law are of equal virtue, which opinion was to be condemned as contrary to the doctrine of the Fathers and the Church, all having said that the old sacraments were only signs of grace, but the new contain it and cause it. It should be noted that the commentary in this book comes from a Protestant author. And Protestants, I'll remind you, for a long time during Martin Luther's time, did not recognize the Old Testament and the law of Moses. I'll continue quoting. No man did contradict the conclusion, but the Franciscans proposed that it should not be said of the old law, but of Moses' law, in regard that circumcision itself did cause grace. But it was not a Moses sacramentum, for Christ also said, it was not of Moses, but of the fathers, and also because other sacrifices before Abraham did confer and cause grace. So, at the Council of Trent in 1547, the Franciscans stated on record that circumcision itself did cause grace. This leads us to conclude that the Franciscans in the 16th century practiced circumcision. Otherwise, Why would they deprive themselves and their flock of divine grace? After all, Jesus was circumcised, for one. And secondly, the New Testament does not prohibit circumcision. The Apostle Paul mentioned that it was no longer mandatory, but that does not mean it was forbidden. And now, practically the final point, the Franciscans in Egypt. Here's what the Coptic Encyclopedia of Claremont College reports on this topic. Not much is known about the first 400 years of Franciscan presence in Egypt. Certainly it was not a continuous one. Around 1632, groups of Franciscans started their life and activity in the land of the Nile and established a presence that has not since been interrupted. And the year 1630 is practically a cutoff year, up to which the Great Pyramids of Giza did not yet exist. On this late 16th century map of Cairo, the limestone hills still feature the pyramids, Joseph's grain storage, as the leader of the Jewish people in Egypt according to the biblical legend. These granaries were purposely built on high ground, as the Nile in the Cairo area would rise up to 8 meters during its flood. The limestone hills in Giza might have looked something like this. These same grain storage pyramids are depicted in the mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, and in Cosmographia by Sebastian Munster, published in the mid-16th century in several European languages, including Latin. In summary, Machu Picchu is located in the Peruvian province of Cusco, where the Franciscans had control from 1533 onward. Most likely, Machu Picchu was created by the Franciscans as a place for the training and education of builders, a kind of construction school, as well as a laboratory and testing ground for developing new construction technologies and building materials. The Franciscans were also present in Egypt, in Cairo, and Japan, Edo, modern Tokyo. In each location, the Franciscans left their mark with artificial granite. The Franciscans taught the indigenous people of Latin America and the Copts of Egypt various religious rituals from the Old and New Testaments, including circumcision and baptism. The Copts still widely practice male circumcision, even though they are considered Orthodox Christians. But with the Copts, descendants of the ancient Egyptians, it's not so straightforward, as it is officially believed that the Jews adopted the ritual of circumcision from the ancient Egyptians. However, the Franciscans themselves declared at the Council of Trent that circumcision in itself brought divine grace. Too many coincidences. The Franciscans left behind not only buildings and structures, but also religious rituals among the peoples they Christianized. It is most likely that the official renunciation of circumcision by Catholics occurred at the Council of Trent, where the topic of circumcision was repeatedly addressed. This may explain why there are no records of the Japanese practicing circumcision in the 16th century, as the first Catholic missionaries reached Japan during the Council of Trent, where it was decided that the ritual of circumcision was no longer mandatory, or perhaps even forbidden for Christians. Later, when the history of Christianity was rewritten, the decisions of the Council of Trent were distributed across various councils solely on paper, including the councils of Nicaea and Jerusalem. And Franciscans arrived in Mexico and Peru before the Council of Trent. Why am I illustrating this statement with the mountain terraces of Machu Picchu? Because identical mountain terraces existed in the Philippines, where Catholic missionaries arrived in 1521. Whether Europeans adopted this technology for growing fresh produce in the mountains from the Filipinos, or the Filipinos from the Europeans, is not important. Let me remind you that in Peru, the Franciscans built these terraces near their silver mines to feed their workers with fresh produce. The key point in our research is that Catholic missionaries reached the Philippines before the Council of Trent. And here's something interesting. In the Philippines, the majority of local Catholics still practice male circumcision. I publish articles on historical topics on Medium. Subscribe to stay updated. My books are available on Amazon. That's all for today. I would sincerely appreciate your likes, comments, and shares of my films on social media. Thank you, and until next time. This was Alexander Tomansky.